Hi, Rich Hoffman here. So it's a good question. The discussion about protesters in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and why those protesters are bad as opposed to the protesters in Iran or in Venezuela or in Hong Kong or wherever there are protesters. What are good protesters and what are bad protesters, and how do we distinguish one from the other? So how can we be, as the United States, against the protesters in Minneapolis, but before the protesters in Iran? Because we're hoping for you don't come out and say it. It's for toppling regimes, but obviously we don't like the governments in those places. And if the protesters retake their government, we're good with it. But yet you have these protesters trying to overthrow the government of the United States, and somehow we're against it. At least that's the media perception of it. So how can you say one's better than the other? Well, that's when you start coming down to the value of what money measures, and that's cultures, capitalist society, initiative, ownership, the preservation of free will, of self-asserted government. When people throw the word democracy around, they confuse it often with with mob rule versus the ability to have representatives in a republic, but then a majority of the people to be able to pick their representatives in a way that is conducive to the will of society as a mass. So what are they protesting in Minnesota? They're protesting policy, and they're trying to change policy through force. And that is the policies of this picked government that we made, the Trump administration, and various state and local governments, and what they enact as far as policy. In this case, it's federal policy and it's immigration policy. And you have advocates trying to overthrow through seditious means that trend. So you have what you call leftist protesters, essentially committing acts of sedition to overthrow the current regime. The current government, that's the Trump government that we just elected in the United States. Now in Iran, you have tyrannical regimes that are in place that have been suppressing people for a long time. And you would like to see those tyrannical regimes removed. And the means to do that is some sort of protest. Well, they don't have free speech and protections the way we do in the United States in those places. So in the case of this, where there were mass hangings that were proposed for those who were instigating violence against the government. That's the way the rest of the world works. And so when we talk about ICE agents or the police and these authority means that we have just to suppress expression through protests, that's what we're talking about in the United States. Is do you have the right to peacefully protest if it's trying to incite seditious activity, which in this case it is, as opposed to actual tyrannical governments, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, Venezuela, wherever those regimes are. The intent is regime change through force, and you have a tyrannical government trying to prevent that from happening. So it's through force that they suppress their ability to have a change state, because they don't have free elections. So it always comes back down to free elections and whether or not the government that's in power is the one that is representative of the people. And that's where your distinction is. So how can you say that these leftists, even though they think that they're well-intentioned, they believe they're doing right, even though we look at them as if they have two heads and they're crazy lunatics, the suppression that they're trying to instigate is one of sedition against a government that was picked by its people through an election process. That's why it's important to have paper ballots, and it's why you have to have tight controls on your same-day elections. And you can't have a bunch of mail-in ballots that are made up in a Walmart parking lot all of a sudden being thrown into the vote count. If that's what you have going on, then you can't say that the government you have has been picked by the people. So then people will have to rise up and take it back. That's not the case in Minneapolis. That's not the case what's going on in Minnesota or some of these blue states where radical leftists are trying to provoke behind a cloak of free speech, seditious behavior to overthrow the government that was picked by people. But in Iran, those places were taken by force. In Cuba, it was taken by force. And in China was taken by force. And you have communist regimes that are central authority figures to suppress through election fraud the will of the people. So in those cases, you want to see those tyrannical regimes brought down, and you want to see people restored to the kind of government they want to self-assert. And if they can't do it through an election means, they have to do it through violent means. The very same argument that we're having here in the United States. If like for instance, the deep state fantasizes that they're going to be able to kind of through administrative means, slow walk Trump, wait him out, let him come and go through office, let people have their cake or have their icing on the cake and have a little dessert, and then the mature people of global finance will take back over and run things again. That fantasy is never going to happen, because what happens if you don't have an executive branch that's strong and enacts what people voted it to do, then you're going to have people turn then towards means of insurrection and take back the country, not through legal means, but through force, because that government is held on to its power through force, and force will then only dislodge it. If they don't respect the election process, which clearly these protesters in Minnesota don't, because the Trump administration was elected popularly to do exactly what it's doing, to enact policy. And people are hoping that the Trump administration has the ability to do, so they don't have to pick up the pitchforks themselves and go do it outside the realm of our three branches of government. The hope is that Trump will be successful in enacting the powers that were given to him through the executive branch, through the election process, to enact policy that people voted for. In places where that's not happening, in other places where we're saying, hey, Iranian protesters, take back your country and we'll support you. Hey, people in Mexico, you don't want to be run by drug cartels, we'll support you. Hey, here's an example. We're going to take over operations in Venezuela. So we have your back, and if you find yourself in trouble, then we'll be there to help you out. Same in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been trying to protest the tyrannical Chinese Communist Party for a very long time, and only recently have they been emboldened to try and push back, only because they see how the United States is supporting that kind of rebellion. And only when you have that kind of leverage can you then inspire people to take back their governments and run their own governments and have self-government. But what you have are really tyrannical regimes trying to stay in power. And in the United States, that presence comes through the Democrat Party, through progressive politics, communist movements that have been trying to work in the background for a long time. And now they're instigating violence behind a very thin veil of free speech. And that is a seditious behavior when you have an elected government that was just put in place by people who properly voted for that government, and now we have 4 years to enact it, and people can judge if that's what they want or not at the end of that 4 years. But to try and stonewall that and hope to wait out Trump's administration or create some sort of legal loopholes that prevent the actions that he was elected to do from happening is the same kind of nonsense that these other countries have already enacted, which is government by force and pushing people in ways that they don't want to be pushed and living under tyrannical regimes. And only through the power of the United States do these voices have a chance to rise up and take back their governments from these authoritative communist dictators. And that's why it's a big difference. We're trying to prevent that from happening in the United States with these implanted cells that are trying to steer various important parts of the United States in a communist direction, which is what's happened in Minneapolis, and trying to use the civil rights as a platform to usher in communism. That's why they call the People's Republic of China. They try to usher in authority rule of communism on the backs of the people and saying it's for the good of the people to have a parental government that takes care of everybody and does everything for them, but doesn't allow them to run their own government through free and open elections. They have rigged elections, and they've tried to do those rigged elections here in the United States. Rigged elections didn't work in 2024. We have an administration that represents people in place, and now they're enacting what it is that they were elected to do. And these communist protesters that come up in these little blue cells, blue city cells, are trying to prevent that from happening so they can have exactly the kind of things that these other places in the world are trying to get away from. So when you say that leftists are trying to do what they think is right, they're just having a difference of opinion. Well, what they're doing is seditious, and they have a communist intention that means to overthrow free and open elections that give people power over their governments. And that's the difference between protests in the United States and protests other places in the world where we want to see those protests occur, topple those administrative mechanisms of tyrannical power, and restore governance that people can agree on, and have self-government in faraway places that currently don't have it, such as Iran. And that's the difference between Minnesota and Iran and other places, and why we don't like protests in Minnesota, but we do like protests in Iran, Hong Kong, Venezuela, everywhere, even in England, it's swinging way in the other direction these days, and needs to correct itself pretty quick. And that's the difference. Anyway, it's Rich Hoffman here. Share, subscribe, make tomorrow a better day. If you haven't read my book, The Gunfighter's Guide to Business, I think you'll love it. Anyway, have a good day. See you later.